But damn wolf, you can't compare Charles Manson to Richard Ramirez. Uh, that's not even in the same ballpark. Shit, that's not even the same fucking game. Hold on a minute. Let me get some of this medicine down the neck. Look, here's the thing. I don't worship Charles Manson. I don't think he was a great guy. In fact, I think he was kind of a scummy human being. However, the reason I'm fascinated with the Tex Watson murders, that's what I refer to them as. I'll never refer to them as the Charles Manson murders. I'll refer to them as the Tex Watson murders because that's who planned the shit out. That's who fucking carried it out. Charles Manson was never given an opportunity to put on a defense. Charles Manson admitted out of his own mouth that he is an accessory after the fact. He is an accessory to murder after the fact, which in the state of California at that time carried a sentence for someone with his rap sheet. It carried a sentence of between 12 and 18 years in prison. Not life without the possibility, and for damn sure, not the fucking death penalty. That's what gets me about that whole fucking case. Think what you want about the guy. It's not about him. It's about how a person in the United States of America can have their rights completely taken away from them and be sentenced to death because of some bullshit ass story that some power hungry prosecutor made up out of whole cloth. Yeah, you can't compare Manson to Ramirez. Manson never killed anybody. He shot a guy, the guy lived. He cut a guy, the guy lived. But he never killed anybody. But yeah, keep doing the serial killer documentary thing. But if you want to compare somebody to Ramirez, there's a whole bunch of them you could go with. Bundy, Gacy, Dahmer, Buck the Zodiac, who was the son of Sam Berkowitz? Yeah, one of them guys. But not Manson. Shout outs. No fucking shout out to SWV. No fucking shout out to Reet Geeb. Shout out to Robert Douglas. Cringe, dogs. Fucking cringe. Used to be. Seis.
Same sort of interplay going on in terms of whatever parts of our brain are being stimulated. It's boxing plus. It's pro wrestling with weapons for real. And, as all sporting events, you don't know who's going to win. Training may come into it, coaching, strategy, tactics. I mean, sports fans could get into something like that, could bet on it. I could see it. To me, these executions, though, are different. And even if most of the crowd didn't go in for the butchery, like Professor Fagan had said, certainly a number of people did. I'm reminded of another quote by Seneca talking about the games, and it was like a throwaway line, but it was something about how he was insinuating you couldn't allow even a dull moment between acts, and said that the crowd, or something to the effect, had called for some throat cutting in the meantime so that they wouldn't get bored. Again, a throwaway line, but the horrificness of the actual imagery, if you imagine it, is sobering. So why did the Romans like it, and how did they justify it? Don't these seem like the most logical follow-up questions? The why they liked it part we're going to continue to talk about because it's really sort of the focus here. I mean, the obvious things that come to mind right away is curiosity about any of these things. Maybe first of all, maybe you're Seneca and you came for all the other stuff and you just got grossed out by the violence. Probably not, but maybe. Or maybe you're curious. You want to see what this looks like. One of the other things that's talked about in events like these is even if you've been to many of them before, this is not scripted content, right? This is like a live sporting event in the sense that you don't want to DVR it and hear what happened later. You have to be there because something weird could happen, and sometimes does. So there's curiosity. There is sheer sadism, and sadism's a weird thing. I think, again, my opinion, and totally non-academic and unqualified, but doesn't it seem like some of the tendencies that are more unusual on an individual level become more common on a crowd level? So whereas it might be rather rare to meet someone who's a sadist in a crowd of people, as a crowd of people, I think we're more sadistic. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, maybe, kind of thing. And as for how the Romans justified this, because let's remember, by our modern standards, they are harsh and brutal and strict, even in this period where it's off their highs. They used to be stricter. They're loosening up a little by our standards. They're still very strict. The Romans were into things like law, though, and reason and all these sorts of deals. So how did they look at this kind of stuff and say to themselves, well, listen, this serves a good purpose? Well, here's how our old friend, writing many decades ago, Will Durant, put it. It's a nice, succinct description. Quote, most Romans defended the gladiatorial games on the ground that the victims had been condemned to death for serious crimes, that the sufferings they endured acted as a deterrent to others, that the courage with which the doomed men were trained to face wounds and death inspired the people to Spartan virtues, and that the frequent sight of blood and battle accustomed Romans to the demands and sacrifices of war. End quote. He then mentions several famous Roman writers and how they basically supported the idea of the games, and then gets to Cicero, the lawyer, writer, at one time consul, famous at the end of the Republican period. And even though Cicero would make comments approving of the games sometimes, he also said this, which is a pretty humanist sort of thing for a Roman writer to put pen to paper about. Durant says about Cicero and the games, quote, Cicero was revolted by the slaughter. Quote, this is Cicero, what entertainment can possibly arise to a refined and humanized spirit from seeing a noble beast struck to the heart by its merciless hunter, or one of our own weak species cruelly mangled by an animal of far greater strength? End quote. As we said earlier, trying to figure out why the people in Rome enjoyed these violent entertainments is something that's been interesting to people for a very long time and crosses into that territory between a couple of disciplines like psychology and history. It has so many variables that it's not surprising that you don't have widespread agreement on what this is. I mean, people argue, and the prevailing theory tends to change every decade or so. There are some commonalities, the things you run into generally most of the time, and the number one commonality, something that won't surprise any of us, when we ask how these ancient people could watch other human beings treated this way, it's easy if you don't consider them to be human beings, and the dehumanization of the victims here is obvious. I mean, as everyone you'll read points out, the vast majority of these people who are dying in the arena are slaves, one way or the other. Now, they may not have been slaves their whole lives. If you capture somebody on the battlefield and make them prisoners, they can be slaves the next day. And a lot of these people who died in the arena, by the way, were captured prisoners, sometimes made to fight other prisoners for the enjoyment of the crowd. Nonetheless, the idea that we expect some sort of empathy and sympathy from the crowd might be flawed if the crowd sees these people as, well, what the Nazis would have called the Untermenschen, right? These are subhumans, these are slaves, they're people with no rights, and they're people that are widely reviled in the society, especially the ones at the lowest level, especially the ones that have broken Roman law. We said earlier, how many people would be appalled at the idea of watching some horrific torture execution today, and how many would change their mind if you said, yes, but it's this horrible dictator, this is a Hitler or a Saddam Hussein or somebody we're doing it to. How many people would go, oh, well, in that case, count me in? Well, for a lot of the Roman crowd, I was reading stuff by several different authors, Kyle among them, who were suggesting that a big part of the Roman desire to watch this stuff comes from seeing the victims in a similar light to that, right? They're deserving of this. Therefore, why not get a little bit of enjoyment from their death while at the same time making it so horrible that other people who might think of doing this are dissuaded? Now, before we leave the Roman example, there's one element that's worth bringing up because it's an estuary, if you will. It's a crossover point between the modern violent entertainment and the ancient entertaining violence. And it has to do with something that some historians call the fatal charade. The fatal charade is something that you can easily imagine developing because you need to have more novel and new things to bring in the crowds. I mean, remember, at the Colosseum, they were having naval battles take place for the crowds with water. I mean, the spectacles are amazing, so you can imagine how the dynamics of it all mean that, these grow to unimaginable proportions, a little bit like history podcasts that become 6 hours long. But these fatal charades involved using the condemned criminals in plays, comedy, drama, anything like that, dressing them up as characters, putting, sets up and having them reenact what went on in the story. But the stories they pick are often homicidal and involve maimings. And so what they did then was they did it for real. We said earlier, what if you made one of those previews that they show at the movie theater for an action film but used real bullets and had real people get really hurt? What would that be like? Maybe like these, fatal charades in Rome. Historian Donald G. Kyle, in his notes, quoting several other historians, wrote about the fatal charade, quote, "The combination of theater and execution in the amphitheater was not theater proper, but rather, Barch says, a violation of the theatrical by the actual, or rather, a conflation of the two, not a representation, but a replication." As she notes, the actual death in the charades fulfilled the requirements of both the plot and the penal code. End quote. That's a crazy line. That the deaths in these fatal plays met the needs of both the plot and the penal code. That it wasn't a representation like a movie would be today. It was a replication. It's like doing a story on the Manson family murders, but reenacting them rather than replicating them on film. And what makes it so different is it's right in your face. There's no doubt that people are really enjoying this, whereas in all the other situations that come to mind that would involve other ancient peoples that you can find, it's so hard to disentangle the religion from the ritual and, the lack of sources to tell you specifically that people were having a good time, to figure out, as we said, whether or not the Aztecs are enjoying watching this ceremony involving human sacrifice, or whether it's all part of some giant, religious ritual that sort of overlays the entire question, that explains it in a way that's